Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Carbon Neutral Shipping webinar. I'm pleased to be accompanied by Randy Giveans, Senior VP Equity Research for Energy Maritime at Jefferies, Ben Nolan, Managing Director for the Maritime sector at Stifel Financial, Mike Moore, CEO at Rigby Refining. The panelists today will be discussing the current challenges in shipping to get to zero emissions. The discussion will address environmental concerns, upcoming regulations, alternative fuels, and next steps to achieve zero emissions. At the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions for the panelists to address. If you are interested in asking a question and are logged into the GoToWebinar app or web platform, you could submit your questions to us by typing them into the questions module at any time throughout the presentation. Please note the presentation is being recorded today, Wednesday, May 12, 2021, and will soon be made available to the registrants. Lastly, RBMG is a full-service investor relations firm with offices in New York City and Stamford, Connecticut, working with global private and publicly listed companies in various sectors. For more information, please visit rbmilestone.com. We'll kick off today by having the panelists introduce themselves, and so we'll start with you, Randy.
Sure thing. Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, RBMG, for hosting. As Trevor said, my name is Randy Giveans, head of the Energy Maritime Shipping Equity Research Department here at Jefferies. Been here for about a decade now, covering 31 different shipping companies, ranging from crude tankers, product tankers, LNG carriers, LPG carriers, dry bulk, and container ships. And I'm based in Houston, Texas.
Mike, or Ben, start with you next.
Okay. My name's Ben Nolan. I'm with Stifel. I am also in the research side, covering primarily shipping. I've been doing that for I don't know, 16, 17 years, something like that. And also do a good bit of energy infrastructure work. And am based in Chicago and at the moment in my bedroom. So, Mike.
Yeah, I can't top that. My name is Mike Moore, the CEO at Rigby Refining. Rigby's business our research is very different. We do a lot of research around marine fuels. Hold or co-inventor or inventor on 16 granted patents globally, another 70 in processing specifically around this space. I'm going to say just over 20 years in the refining and technology space, because I don't want to reveal how old I really am. So I've been at this a long time, started the company about 4 years ago, and obviously very heavily engaged in watching not just these two guys, but the market in general and the client base in general.
Thanks, guys. So we'll kick off with the topic one being impact of IMO 2020 on ship owners and the environment. Mike, you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, so, I think at first I'd stipulate that the impact of the environment really isn't something that can be disputed. We've already seen, just on a statistical basis, a drop in the emissions because of the requirement. So overall, it's achieving the goal of reaching an improvement to emissions, particularly from shipping, which is one of the largest sources of emitters in the space. But when we get to, my view is, when we talk about the impact of 2020 and ship owners, there's a disconnect a little bit between refining and ship owners. This is the only market I've ever been in where the producer of the fuel and the consumer of the fuel are so far disassociated. And so the impact as far as 2020 goes, I don't think that book is written yet. I don't think we can take a backward look at this point and say 2020 is a done deal. Some in the industry are saying that, but I believe that COVID actually had a very large impact on refining. And because of those reductions in throughput in refining, a lot of the materials that were cracked to make materials for, road transportation, air transportation, rather than being cracked, ended up in the marine fuel market. Right, so I don't think we've actually seen the impact of the ship owner into shipping in the marine fuel market yet, and I do think we'll see it more as markets return in terms of consumption. So I'll just lob that one to you guys, and Let me know how you want to go on there.
Yeah, I think 15 months ago, right, pre-COVID, 16 months ago, you had a massive fuel spread with VLSFO $300 a ton more than HSFO. So very profitable for scrubber operators. VLSFO was extremely high. HSFO was kind of stable. And then obviously COVID hit and crude pricing collapsed, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline, everything collapsed. And as a result, that spread tightened materially to maybe $30–40 a ton at the bottom. Now it has since expanded back to around $100 a ton. And just to put that in context, that's about 6,000 to 7,000 a day on a VLCC when you're burning 60 to 70 tons a day. On a Cape size, burning 30 to 35 tons a day, that's $3,000, $3,500 a day premium for those with scrubbers. So the companies that have scrubbers on them have already been operating them for a year now, have probably repaid 30 to 50% of the upfront capex. Now, with a $100 a ton spread, it's not really incentivizing additional scrubber additions. Now, you are seeing some new buildings being placed with scrubbers during construction, but not many retrofits at these levels. So that's the big thing we've seen on the scrubber front when it comes to IMO 2020.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different approach, and this comes from the perspective of, let's say, the investing community. I think, again, going into the end of 2019 and the early parts of 2020, again, pre-COVID, it made shipping topical, right? It sort of brought everything that we see to the forefront. People cared a lot. Now, for I think two reasons. First of all, we've just sort of passed that milestone, right? And so no longer is it really necessarily an event-driven catalyst. That it sort of is moved out of the forefront of people's minds. And then the other thing is, as we've talked about here, and probably in large part because of COVID, it just didn't play out, at least initially, as dramatically as sort of how a lot of people thought, other than the month of January. And so when I can tell you, when investors are calling me, IMO 2020 almost never comes up anymore, other than, oh, don't you remember that thing a long time ago? And so, I'd say it's sort of out of the psyche of people, whether or not investors are going to weigh that into their investment decisions, even to some extent, whether a company has a scrubber or not. I'd say at the moment, no. People are like, whatever, fine. It's more about sort of the macro trends. And if the absolute rates of a dry bulk ship or a tanker or something are going up, well, the nuances behind fuel efficiency are sort of secondary or tertiary. And furthermore, I'd say in general, we don't even get a lot of questions from people saying, okay, well, how much on an absolute basis have they reduced their emissions? Because frankly, that never, people who are very ESG or environmentally focused are generally, not investing in shipping on that basis. It's simply not sort of at the forefront of that conversation. So I think where we stand today is, and I guess I wouldn't disagree with Mike that it could become more important, but I think from an investing psychology standpoint, the bar is pretty high. It's you just don't have the juice like you used to have. And frankly, if oil demand never really materially gets much more than let's call it 100,000 barrels a day, 100 million barrels a day, and refinery capacity sort of remains loose-ish, which might not happen if refineries continue to be closed down. But will we ever see these massive blown out spreads again? I don't know, Mike. You're probably in a better position to talk to that than I am.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see that massive blowout again that we saw in January. I think that was an anomaly based on particularly what you mentioned is that, the one part of this that always gets left out is the ship owner, right? IMO 2020 was a big event and it was talked about in refining very heavily. The perspective from refining was we're going to make more distillates, right? where are we going to put these high sulfur fuels? But you can't refine a barrel of crude and not have something, not have nothing left over. Those residues are what ends up in the shipping market, right? And so what we saw is we started to see a lot of the high sulfur fuel oil and large producing companies come into the U.S. kind of reverse and go into cokers, into refining rather than ships, right? Because you didn't have to put as much feedstock in the front of your refinery. You could run your coker at an advantage, right? Those dynamics have already changed in the market. So I don't think we're going to see those kind of giant spreads again, but the ship owner is kind of left outside of the discussion once again. They weren't there really that much. They talked about that much. IMO 2020 was its own event. It revolved around scrubbers and fuel pricing. And, you know, that happened and the attention span has moved along into larger ESG focused things. But we're still seeing an uptick in ship owners, you know, issues with these blended VLSFOs, which, you know, there's one thing that gets missed is a dramatic change in the fuel quality. Right now, it still burns, it still meets the ISO spec, but it's very low viscosity. Because that any amount of cat fines has massive detrimental harm compared to a higher lubricity, higher viscosity material. And you still have to find a place to dispose of these residues. Where's that going to happen, right? So I don't think we'll see 40-something, $50-something spreads again, but I do think in the mid-20s is reasonable and rational because the majority of those materials are based on distillates. And even if there's no further growth in refining, that doesn't mean there's not going to be growth in demand, right? We still have a lot of the world that's coming up in terms of growing middle income earners, buying cars, needing fuel, traveling. Those things aren't going to stop, even if we stop at 100 million days of production capacity, right? Refining capacity. Mike.
And yeah, to clarify, those numbers that Mike was using was on a per barrel basis, right? So there's $25 a barrel. That's about, you know, $150 plus $170 a ton, and that's with the shipping side. So refining's all about the per barrel, shipping's all about the per ton. So just wanted to clarify those numbers.
Yeah, Randy, thank you, because it took me 18 months to figure that out when we started. Yeah, and then you really want to start getting into, let's look at the density conversions, right? And we spend a lot of time around that because, yeah, we take a 6.3 barrel per ton and make a 6.6 VLSFO, and our competitive products are a 7.2, 7, you know, something like so. Trying to explain to that someone after I understood it was difficult. I'll try to think in barrels or in tons at this point. Thank you.
I definitely have some density issues for sure.
Yeah, I'm with you.
So fellas, what do you say we move on to the next topic here, which is key environmental concerns and potential new regulations, covering topics saying, you know, IMO 2023, IMO 2030, perhaps alternative fuels, you know, which one is really going to take the cake, being LNG, ammonia, hydrogen, and so on. So Randy, if you want to kick off with that one.
Sure, yeah. As we just discussed, IMO 2020, all about sulfur emissions, right? Now we're looking at IMO 2023, IMO 2030, all about carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. And so a lot of that can be satisfied with switching from your high sulfur fuel oil or even your very low sulfur fuel oil to a dual fuel like an LNG powered ship. And that's what we've certainly seen a lot of the focus on in the last probably 2 years is these LNG powered VLCCs, LNG powered Capesizes, LNG powered very large container ships, right? Because it does satisfy a lot of the carbon emissions. Now, looking much further out, IMO 2050, does it satisfy methane slip and everything else? Probably not. So that's why the near-term focus has been on LNG. Part of it is the technology is proven and the access to LNG is available, right? You can find LNG in the US Gulf. You can find it in the Middle East with all that cutters liquefying over there. You can find it in Australia. You can find it in Asia, Singapore, Europe. So it's very, the infrastructure is pretty much in place for LNG powered ships. Not the case for the next fuel type, right? If you're looking at ammonia or you're looking at hydrogen or something like this, where that has certainly been a longer term focus. You know, people are saying those are the future fuels, but we haven't seen hardly any ammonia powered ships being built or being ordered right now. We've seen some from like Euronav, for example. They bought these VLCCs that are LNG fuel ready and ammonia fuel ready. Not saying they will or can run on that today or right out of the water, but over the next 2.5 years as they're being built, they can be converted to run on one of those alternative fuels. So that's what a lot of people are doing now, just to have that optionality to be able to run on LNG or to switch entirely to ammonia or hydrogen. So all that being said, I think in the near term, the focus will be on LNG fuel, those kind of dual fuel assets. And then further down the road, you look at, 2030 and beyond, you'll likely see more of a focus on ammonia, but we're still a few years away from that technology.
Yeah, if I can chime in here, I generally agree with what Randy's saying. The challenge is that I think, well, first of all, even LNG is not universally accepted as the next fuel of choice, right? And furthermore, it comes at a cost. Certainly there is some infrastructure, but it's not nearly as ubiquitous as a fuel oil infrastructure would be. And for a decent sized ship, it's an extra $10 million to make it LNG equipped. Well, that's okay if it's $150 million large container ship. It's not okay if it's a $35 million Supermax, right? $10 million just makes the economics unworkable unless you have really astronomical expectations for freight rates. And granted, lately things have been getting better, but nonetheless, you're not seeing your lower end cheaper ships. First of all, they're not being ordered very much, and then secondly, even if they are being ordered, they're still conventional or largely conventional, so I think it's pretty problematic. And again, furthermore, we're not at a point where a lot of people are willing to just sort of plant the flag and say, LNG is going to be the future. And not only is ammonia or methanol or even hydrogen not readily available, but those are all built on the idea that you have easy access to green ammonia or hydrogen ultimately, or methanol, because otherwise you might as well just use the LNG in the first place if natural gas is your source of hydrogen for those components. So there's a lot of wood to be chopped, and frankly, I think there's even we're way early on this, but I think there's even a case to be made for something like nuclear, which completely gets away from conventional fuel altogether.
Right.
But we're way early in that conversation. I mean, there's a lot of countries in the world that won't allow a nuclear powered ship, submarine or aircraft carrier or whatever into their ports. So how are they going to feel about, somebody's little, iron ore carrier? No chance.
Right.
No
Yeah.
chance.
Like, I got to agree with you, Ben, on a lot of that. And Randy, a lot of years as well. But I'll tell you, I spent a number of years in the U.S. Navy. There were a lot of ports we couldn't even get within 12 miles of, right? Because it was a nuclear powered vessel. But, you raise a really good point also in that ammonia, for example, one of the things that people say, you'll hear a lot about ammonia is there are no NOx emissions, right? But that presumes perfect combustion. And from a technical standpoint, the only way to make that happen is to use liquid or use oxygen as your air source, right? As your combustion source. Now you're talking about putting liquid oxygen on vessels. Last time I checked, the only place they really use that any kind of combustion is on the space shuttle. So when you look at ammonia, you still have to have natural gas to make ammonia. I think you were alluding to that, Ben. It takes a lot of natural gas to make ammonia. It takes a lot of natural gas and a lot of power to make hydrogen. It's one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the industry, hydrogen production, right? So now you have to find a way to make the green routes technically feasible. I don't think we're anywhere near that just yet, right? And on the infrastructure piece with LNG, it might make sense that the infrastructure is in place for some of the carriers who milk run between these, available infrastructure. But as we know, it just doesn't take care of the majority of the fleet. Nobody's going to put a 30% of their value investment onto, to make a dual motor engine. It's just not going to happen. Then on top of all of that, there's been a lot of activity lately from the World Bank, from several governments that were looking at contracts, who are coming out and saying you can no longer look at LNG emissions on a ship from from the tank to the wake. You got to look at it from the well to the wake. And it's one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters out there, period. Still have to get it out of the ground. Methane slip is a very difficult problem. It has not been overcome technically. So we have a long way to go on these things. Doesn't mean that they won't happen. But, one of the things that kind of, I don't know if frustrates the right word, but I dig into a lot is, why are we skipping over the whole transition piece, right? Why are we going immediately from IMO 2020 to ammonia, hydrogen, further green ammonia and green hydrogen? Because without government subsidies, those things don't work even in the future, right? And so what point do you start impacting what the market wants, right? What the market's willing to do? Right now, without those subsidies, a lot of these guys won't make these investments.
And I think you're seeing that right now. I mean, they're outside of container shipping, and to some extent things like LNG, which again are primarily using their own cargo as fuel. There's not been a lot of ship ordering. I think that is probably the primary culprit behind it. People don't know what to do, much less have conviction behind it. But and maybe this is sort of the direction that you were headed, Mike. I mean, you look at the global fleet of cargo ships, it's a little over 60,000 ships in the world, right? A grand total of those may be something like 2,000 run on anything other than an oil-based product. And most of that 2,000 are LNG ships that are using their own cargo as fuel. We're sort of not even in the batter's box of the first inning yet. And there's a long way to go here, I think.
Yeah, and we still have the energy density issue to overcome, right? I mean, ammonia, for example, you need 2.5 or 2.2 times the amount of ammonia to get the same, calorific or generated energy value as you do from a VLSFO, right? So now you need more space, and they have to be super cool. And just inserting more and more problems on a ship that, even when overcome, really amount to less area for cargo to be transported. What happens to your efficiency index at that point, right? So you get a balance from one, but now we need more of these ships. It's I know I'm oversimplifying that, Randy and Ben, so don't hold me too close to that. But that's really what I'm getting at, right? Is that there's still the most efficient fuel out there are the higher density fuels. They're hydrocarbon based. Why are we skipping over the whole let's get it addressed while we work on those other problems, the transition space? Scrubbing, another thing that doesn't talked about with scrubbing very often is the fact that those are metal systems in saltwater service with acidic materials in it. They do not have an infinite life. That the scrubber's life is not 20 years. We're hearing things like 3 to 5 before you have to replace a lot of that metallurgy, right? And you can't use alternative materials for the scrubber because you can't have the temperature and pressure ratings that you need. So it's just another thing to be overcome. On top of that, the infrastructure to actually install these. Last I read, and it's been a while, you could only install about 600 a year globally. I don't know if that number's gone up. I think it should have. But there's no way you get the entire fleet converted before the entire fleet converts to new vessels, right? With new builds. And that's going to take decades, not a couple of years.
Yeah, I think sort of where we're headed here is that something has to give, right? Either the regulations need to change, or there needs to be some sort of subsidies to get people to where they need to be, because right now the pace of transition is just too slow to meet the targets that people are talking about. And if that's the case, ships are going to be using oil for a whole lot longer than what people, may aspire to.
Yeah, there's a lot.
I think that's a perfect transition. I mean, putting a spark in the system here and implementing penalties. So I mean, talking about what will be enforced. The impact on slow steaming moving forward. I think that's something that Randy, Ben, I mean, really all of you guys can address. But next topic here, next steps in shipping to get to zero emissions. Let's try to wrap that up on that one. So Ben, if you want to touch on those, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I think the challenge here is that, as Mike was talking about, you kind of have two different worlds, right? You have the refining group and you have the shipping group. And when you think about the shippers, it generally speaking is very fragmented, it's highly commoditized, and none of these guys can afford to come in with a model that is materially more expensive because they can't earn any more on that than anybody else. And so as a function of that, nobody is ever incentivized to change, just from a purely economic standpoint, unless they're sort of forced into it from a regulatory perspective. And so, you know, you do have these IMO 2030 stipulations. And the one thing I would say is there was a lot of, especially ship owners, who were of the opinion that as we were approaching IMO 2020, that it was too onerous, and that the regulations were going to be changed or adapted or something else because the ship owners were bearing the brunt of the burden. However, that did not happen. And the IMO held a very tight line, and it has sort of created a two-tier market that would have probably been more two-tiered had it not been for the pandemic. But at this point, you know, again, if we're going to see large scale change, absolutely, it's going to have to be forced down people's throats. There's kind of no other way around it. There are some folks that are willing to sort of do altruistic, you know, okay, if I'm Shell. If I'm Shell and I want to have, you know, my absolute carbon number be down a little bit, then maybe I'll charter some ships on a long-term basis that use LNG, and so I can look good, and I can hide the economics of that somewhere else in my balance sheet. But if you're just if you happen to be a ship owner who has 3 or 4, you know, mid-lifed dry bulk vessels, you're not going to do anything. Unless somebody puts a gun to your head and physically says this is the way that it's going to be. So we'll see. Again, it does seem like there needs to be some either really stringent requirements, like the inability to trade in many ports around the world or something like that if you don't meet those standards, or something. But at the end of the day, I don't know. Maybe the other guys have more specific examples of something that might be done. But I do think that it's a pretty big ask here, and granted, there is a long lead time. But again, the problem is long lead time, but still with no solution, no good solution. So.
Right.
You know, we're 9 years or 8.5 years away from sort of the implementation of this thing, and that would be all well and good if, you know, you could go out and build a, you know, green ammonia ship and have it run, but you can't. Yeah, it's not practical, and so it does lead to things like slow steaming, right? As an alternative, obviously, any internal combustion engine that's running at a slower speed, it becomes or is less, has less emissions.
Yeah,
right. And so that probably is a solution, but to that end, you know, and that sort of is the ship owner solution, right? That's what they all want. They all want to sort of be required to go slower because that effectively shrinks the global size of the fleet. And if the fleet isn't growing, in fact, if it's shrinking but demand is the same, well, they can charge more for their services.
Yep.
And so, you know, again, that was what was really proposed by many people in IMO 2020, and maybe it would have played out that way, but the pandemic happened. So we'll see. Again, I don't have a great sense that even from a regulatory perspective, any of this is anywhere close to sort of where it needs to be. To really force change now, and so change won't happen if it's not forced.
Yeah, and you'll certainly have to have buy-in from the IMO, right? But you'll also have buy-in from the individual port states, U.S. Coast Guard, and all these other eco zones and everywhere else. And just like with IMO 2020, is there going to be some, you know, cheating and some people who are not fully compliant in smaller regional routes in, you know, wherever in Africa and India or Latin America, wherever, sure. But for the most part, we do see carbon emission as a big deal, mainly because the charterers, as Ben was alluding to, Shell and others are being so mindful of it and so forceful of it. We've seen these things like the Sea Cargo Charter, where Trafigura and Cargill and Shell and Exxon and BP and Glencore and Cargill and whomever, right? All these big charterers that make up 70-80% of all chartering in terms of volumes, are saying, yeah, we are only going to charter ships that comply with these kind of carbon emissions. So it could be part of it is forced down from the governing bodies, IMO and these other port states and flag states. The other is kind of pulled by the chartering community and saying, well, yeah, we don't want to mess with these uncompliant, old vessels that we're going to get in trouble with. Now, it's a lot easier to say and to do that when rates are 10,000 for a VLCC. Not as easy when they're 100. I don't know if they're gonna be as stringent if and when rates go much higher than current levels. So that's certainly a question that only time will tell.
And I think Randy, one other one, you guys kind of schooled me on this before, but our lenders, right? Mortgage holders. Yep. People saying these are the only places we're gonna back you. We're gonna provide this debt for you on these conditions. You're going to be compliant. You're going right. We're only going to work with certain banks. But the market drivers, the IKEAs, the Cargills, the ones that are saying we only will work with these vessels. It's going to be that's going to be the biggest push here, right? But it still doesn't address what is actually zero, right? I don't think there's sort of this. I don't know if it's a misperception or just not thinking about it correctly. It's not as if we're asking shipping to go to zero emissions. We're asking for offsets. We're asking for the net to be zero, right? And I think that makes the 2050 targets more attainable, right? When there are other ways to get that, these deducts so that the net of your emissions is lower or zero. But again, how do you get to that point, right? You still have to get to that still through that point into the transition. So it's not as if we're going to put sails back on vessels. Well, I mean, some people actually are looking at doing that, but anyway, we're kind of go full circle. It's not as if ships have to be completely zero emissions, right? The only thing out there that looks like it's going to be anywhere close to that, as Ben mentioned, would possibly be nuclear vessels. But I just don't think that that's something that's going to be commercially viable. I don't think in our lifetimes, but I'm biased, right? I mean, the protective nature of military vessels that are nuclear based is, borderline obscene. It's just not something. It's a huge risk in my view. So what does actually getting to zero mean? Who pulls? Who pushes? All those forces are there. A lot of them are going to be market based at the end of the day. But I still don't see how we get away from hydrocarbons. And again, I'm biased, right? I mean, we take the high sulfur fuel oil and make VLSFO and keep the properties. We believe that we take the refiners' crap, lack of a better term. That's a technical term, by the way, just to be clear. It's been going in shipping for 40 years, so we don't disrupt the refiners' market. We don't disrupt the shippers' market. And while all this is going on, the next answer involves much larger industrial processes that emit more emissions. So until you get all of these parties in a room, the refiner, the ship owner, the charterer, the IMO, the insurance fund, all the debt, and say, here's how we're going to do this, and here's how we're going to allocate these benefits to hit net zero. I think I agree with you guys. It's just not something that's going to happen anytime soon. That's got to be the push.
Yeah, and I think as Ben was alluding to, there's certainly a big push within the shipping community for these global speed limits, and that's something that can be enforced with all these beacons and GPS corresponders and these other things. So, and that would certainly be good, right? It would a slower speed would be less likelihood of vessels getting stuck in the Suez Canal, less accidents, So it helps a lot of things if everyone just slow down.
And also ship into the market.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. For sure. And the biggest kind of bigger picture question is shipping. I don't know, what do they move? 80% of world goods or something like this, and the carbon emissions is only 10%, or it's some ridiculously low number. where they're all like, look at all the carbon emissions from trucking and from airlines and from everywhere else. Why are we getting so much scrutiny? So that's going to be an interesting discussion and an interesting topic to play out, and who's going to pay for it all.
Yeah, well, I wanted to circle back on the slow steaming side of it. Again, it's really, if your ship owners had their way, that's what it would be. But ultimately, the problem with that is, okay, if everybody goes a little bit slower and you effectively shrink the size of the fleet by 10%, well, you're going to need the fleet to be 10% larger in order to accommodate for all the cargo that's moving. So not only are you sort of offsetting the fuel savings, you're probably making it worse because these engines aren't perfectly efficient. And if you're adding 10% of them into the world, your absolute carbon emission probably go up as a function of slow steaming. So it's kind of disingenuous, to say the least, to simply say, okay, well, slow steaming is going to fix the problem. It certainly doesn't.
No, it fixes the problem for one constituency in the discussion.
Yeah. It makes everybody look better on a standalone basis, but if you think of everything from a global sort of corporate perspective, you've done nothing.
I mean, Mike, who would you say would be that group to really gather everyone together and get the job done? And then on top of that, if you had to pinpoint, say, a country or countries that would be, on the port front when it comes to, say, nuclear, who would be taking the reins on that one, or the leader on that one?
Well, I mean, to the first part of the question, again, it's just such a fragmented, from my perspective, right? Well, again, we see the refiners, we see the terminal and service companies, the bunker companies, the traders. You have the ship owner. The ship owner rarely buys the fuel. It's the charterer. It's just all these different pieces that are just not connected. I mean, to be frank, and you guys have probably heard me say this before, refining has never really cared about shipping as a constituency, right? It's been the place that as global sulfur levels on land and air transportation fuels have been depressed down, these materials have moved into the marine fuel market by virtue of taking more and more out of the barrel and concentrating up these environmental contaminants and putting them in ships. That's what the engines are designed to run on, is that material. So it hasn't been until 2020 we've seen some of the refining majors actually move back into the bunker market that they left 40 years ago. So, I don't know. It's a puzzle. There are a lot of pieces, and there may be two puzzles in that set of pieces we don't know about. So is it the IMO? Well, I think they're doing the most they can from a regulatory body standpoint. But to Randy's point earlier, you've got to empower the port states, right? Or the port states have to be incented to force these regulations down. But how do you get everybody in the same room? I don't know the answer to that. On the nuclear side, I'm just being blunt again. I don't see that really being a serious conversation in commercial shipping at any point in my lifetime. Maybe I'm just a pessimist, but but they say a pessimist is an optimist with experience, right? The security risk alone, I think, is worth not even having the conversation. What ports can you go to? What are you limited to? Who designs the reactors? Where are they built? Where's the material come from? How is it tracked? It just gets to be an incredibly difficult nation state type question.
Yeah, I'll take the other side of that. I think you on the nuclear side, because certainly at the moment it even sort of with the push towards decarbonization, most people would not choose, even for regular electricity, would not choose nuclear as an alternative. All right, so there's an identity crisis issue here, but the reality is that when you're talking about things like molten salt or some of these other things, it's apples and oranges as compared to, let's say, 40 years ago, right? I mean, these things are pretty legitimately safe and well contained. And then the other big thing is, if you think about it, let's say a Cape-size vessel, right? Ordinarily would go, I don't know, 14 knots, something like that. With a nuclear powered ship, I mean, the thing is designed to be able to go without the engine. I mean, it could easily go 30 knots, right? and never have to refuel. Think about your supply chains if that were the case. I mean, it's absolutely transformative if people can get comfortable with it. And again, I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that the upside potential to the global economy is mind-blowing if that's the direction it were to go. And at the moment, we're not there yet. So, but again, I think the economic incentive is enormous, and the environmental incentive is enormous if people can get their minds wrapped around the safety aspect of it.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And Mike said in his lifetime, I don't think he's 85. So maybe not in his lifetime, but in his working lifetime, maybe, right?
Okay,
I do think, yeah, I think nuclear is quite a ways away. But you could also see a Tesla ship, right? You can get a battery powered ship, you can get a solar powered ship, you can get, you know, you want to do these conceptual academic exercises, and you know, you can get a designer to say, oh yeah, we can build that in 2050. Okay. You know, I don't know how much of a point that discussion is. It's kind of like the whole single haul to double haul 20 plus years ago. It was a complete game changer for shipping. So I don't think shipping would go by the wayside. And these companies, year on app, will just be a nuclear powered shipping company like everybody else will. You know, but obviously that takes an entire transition. So it doesn't get rid of shipping companies. So we'll see what happens. But decades away, I think, outside of my career as well.
Yeah, because you're not 85, that's for certain.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not willing to say it's not on the table and it wouldn't be game changing. I personally am not comfortable with it. I don't know that the public would be comfortable with, you know, the fact that the last nuclear disaster that happened because a transformer was in a shed and got flooded, right? One of the most advanced nuclear plants in the world, but it was human error, right? And so, you know, I think it would be transformative. I'm not comfortable with 90,000 little reactors running around the globe, even though they would be small, et cetera. So maybe one day.
Yeah, well, again, it's all about sort of that tail risk, the black swan risk, and people just aren't comfortable with it right now. I mean, if you ever go watch that documentary on Chernobyl, you never want to get within 1,000 miles of a nuclear power plant, right?
Right. But, you know, Randy brings up a point, and, you know, nuclear contributing to shipping by way of battery, right? But again, now we're talking about batteries on ships, and, you know, that's a whole different set of issues. And again, let's look at how the batteries are made, how they're disposed of, what it takes to power that. You know, now we meet with people on occasion who think that they can charge their Tesla. When you ask them where the power comes from, they point at the wall socket, right? That's obviously where it comes from. What's wrong with you guys, right? So you still have to have an efficient means to generate that power, right? And nuclear is one on a large industrial scale, right? But absent that, it's gas or hydrocarbon. So I don't know, batteries are not light either, so it surely wouldn't be a good thing for shipping. But one day, battery technology is going to reach the place where it can store mass, you know, appreciable amounts with different metals that, you know, or fuel cells that provide that type of technology. But again, we're just not there yet because there's no real driver for it other than academic.
Well, and just to put that into, to frame it in, you know, I think, again, if you were to take a Cape-sized dry bulk ship that's carrying iron ore from Australia to China, and today, based on the existing technology, to have enough batteries on it, you'd have to have a whole second Cape-sized ship full of nothing but batteries just to power the first one to get it there in the first place. I mean, there has to be sort of one of these light bulb moments where the technology doesn't make sort of a baby step forward, but like a moon landing step forward before it's ever even sort of part of the conversation.
Right. Agreed.
I mean, for all we know, we have vanadium redox batteries, which are primarily used for larger enterprises, and that space is still required to grow. But for all we know, there's a lighter solution, and those vanadium redox batteries can be added to those ships.
Could be. Again, we're talking about are not simple industrial processes, and also they happen to be floating around in salt water too.
Right. Right. That's
but I mean, you know, what Mike, you probably know how much of global fuel consumption goes to powering ships on an oil basis, like pretty meaningful.
Global,
Yeah, for not a lot of ships, right? It's
yeah,
it's 6% of the global oil consumption for like 62,000 ships.
that's exactly right.
The power consumption we're talking about here is mind blowing and way beyond the scope of what batteries can do.
At this point, yeah.
Yeah, at this point, no question.
And let's remember, when that time comes, you still have to get the vanadium. What's the largest source of vanadium? Crude oil. Comes up in crude. It's one of the largest sources, and mining is the best, right? But there's a lot of vanadium that comes up in crude. A lot of it's removed via catalysis, you know? In fact, I mean, you'll see even in the marine fuel specs, the maximum is 350 for an RMG or 450 for an RMK, ppm, right? Now, do that over 30,000 barrels a day of production, right? And then multiply that times 10, you got a shit ton of vanadium. Excuse me, you have a lot of vanadium. Again, apologies, I was in the Navy a long time, so I'm going to fall back on that sailor talk. So, you know, but everything that we do that's tangential from hydrocarbons has some basis in them, right? You still have to power those batteries. You still have to build the containers for those batteries. A lot of those are plastic because it makes sense and it's non-conductive. And where does that come from? So we're going to get there, but again, it's not about zero. It's about offsets. So, you know, sooner or later it'll happen. That's one area that Rigby is not working on is battery storage. So I can promise you that.
Well, fellas, I think, I mean, you guys have already covered a good amount of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar and some of them that have been submitted live. But we will open it up, see if there are any additional ones. So thanks, everyone. The question and answer session is now open. If you are interested in asking a question and are logged into the GoToWebinar app or web platform, you can submit your questions to us by typing them into the questions module. We will start off with one of the ones that not necessarily has been discussed specifically. Biodiesel, Mike, thoughts?
You know, biodiesel in general is really of interest to us, but not from the perspective of, you still have to have the feedstock, right? I think there was an article recently about one of the refiners, you know, pretty upset because the contract they signed for the renewable diesel feedstock can't be met. You know, the only reason we see, I believe, the only reason we see a lot of activity on renewable diesel in California is because of the subsidies that are in place, right? The credits that are in place. So it makes financial sense. Renewable diesel still requires processing, right? It still has to be run through essentially a hydroprocessing unit. It has to be esterified, has to be stripped from all the acids that are in it to make a viable fuel. And not all of them make viable fuels, they make blend stocks. So there's a lot of potential in renewable. I think there's a lot of potential in one of the things that we do is one of our patents revolves around using biomaterials in high sulfur fuel oil to hydroprocess to make a bio-based VLSFO, right? But again, where do we get the materials? Fortunately for us, it's the heavy part of a bioprocess that doesn't meet the cut rate for diesel. So, but there's not a lot of it out there. So I don't know where, you know, renewable diesel matters. It's going to be significant. But I think in the U.S., at least, we've reached a point where we're not going to have any more growth on that front because there's not enough supply. And the incentives are only in one or two places.
Mike, perhaps what might make sense, I mean, if you can give just a little overview of what Rigby is specifically doing, where you guys are now, where you guys are going moving forward over the next, say, 12 months.
Yeah, specifically what we do is we came up with technology around converting high sulfur fuel, existing compliant ISO 8217 fuel oils into VLSFO while maintaining the bulk properties. So the goal was just to remove the environmental contaminants. And to give you an example, we have, sorry if you hear the Imperial March, that was my brother calling. Anyway, so what we have is we developed a process, a hydrotreating process that takes these materials, converts them. Currently, we license the technology to others. We are building a plant in the U.S. Gulf Coast that's been publicly announced and working on several other projects globally. But our focus all along where we started was A, how do you get to the transition? And B, how do you give the ship owners what they want, which is a material that their engines were designed for, so the qualities of HSFO, but remove the environmental contaminants. And that is essentially where the majority of our business is focused around. We also do R&D on some carbon capture stuff. We hope to be talking about in the next, some period of time, the next 12 to 18 months. But it's been a very interesting 4 years, and we've been lucky enough to receive several patents all around the world, several more in place or applied for, and we have a very strong R&D program that continues. We started the company on the concept of talking to the chief engineer and the engine designer and the ship owner in 2016 with the question of, what do you want for an IMO 2020 fuel? And they all said, well, exactly high sulfur fuel oil we have today, but compliant. And that's the route we chose.
Thanks, Mike. So before wrapping up, let's just see here. All right, there are some other questions coming through. Okay. So quite broad, but feel free to jump in on which who might be the most appropriate one on this. So explain the supply chain. Are the makers of shippers, of ship owners, and of the container ships, also the owners, of other avenues? And this needs to be a little bit further defined here. So bear with me on digesting this. I am trying to understand where the responsibility falls as far as making changes. New vessels. Let's start there.
Well, I think that's a question that's been asked since the day IMO announced who should be responsible, and everybody in the market I've seen is going like this, right? So, Randy, you probably have a better perspective.
No, I was just going to say that, yeah, in the global trade business, the vast majority of ship owners do not own the cargoes or the operations, right? That's why you see the Chevron, Shell, Exxon, BPs of the world chartering out tankers and someone else taking that operational risk, right? Similar on even container ships. Now, Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, some of the large liner companies, they own 40 to 50% of the tonnage that they're using to ship their containers. And they also charter out the remaining 40 to 50% from a Danaos or a Global Ship Lease or Atlas, Costamare, whomever. Same thing in dry bulk, right? The Cargills and Glencores and BHP Billotins of the world, they charter out the shipping component. So who's responsible? The owner of the ship, who's actually emitting the sulfur or the carbon emissions, or the charterer who's using it, right? So that's a good question. If you kind of shrink it down to like car exhaust emissions, if California came out and said you have to cut emissions, whatever, it's probably the Uber or the car drivers, not the passengers who are hiring the cars to get moved around the state, right? So that's why a lot of the ship owners are kind of taking the brunt of it. But again, if the charterers are not willing and able to pay up for these, less emitting assets, then the ship owners aren't just going to take the cost either. So as Mike said, it's a good, everyone else is responsible.
To Randy's point, though, I think ultimately it really comes down to power is how I'd think of it. And the problem is that the charterers can, if you don't have a ship that they like from a, emissions standpoint, well, somebody else will, because turns out there's 3,000 ship owners in the dry bulk space or something like that. And if somebody has something that, is ultimately who is kind of who is the weakest hand, right? It's the ship owners who are the weakest hand. They have zero leverage in this conversation. And so they can bellyache and complain all they want about, these regulations being put on them. But that's what happens when you're in a fragmented, commoditized industry. You know, you know, if you aren't willing to sort of wear that risk, well, your customers aren't going to wear it just because they're nice people, right? They're cutthroat. They're going to cut your throat.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. Randy, your example is spot on, and I think what gets missed is, for example, when the U.S. EPA says we're going to reduce sulfur in gasoline, for example, right? They for all intents and purposes, the law says as a refiner you will not be able to sell a motor gasoline that has a sulfur content greater than X, right? Whereas what the IMO said is that shippers, you will not be able to use a marine fuel that has a sulfur over 0.5%. They didn't tell anybody they had to make it, right? And the impact of Tier 3 regulations in the U.S. was massive investment across the refining structure because they couldn't sell that product as a motor gasoline. You can't really mandate that on a global basis. It has to be done in each nation, right? So, I think that's an interesting distinction that the IMO just said you can't buy it. They didn't say someone had to produce it. So from the refiner's perspective in the traditional refining market, sure, we have all the MGO and distillate you want. You just got to be willing to pay for it.
You guys see any new production on vessels and in general life of the vessel?
What do you mean by that new? Like there's new orders?
I think you can make a ship last a really long time. I mean, there's towboats floating up and down the Mississippi River that are 100 years old. Those are not, to be fair, in the open ocean and being hit by rogue waves and everything else that goes on. But if you spend the money, you can keep the thing afloat. The problem is spending the money part of it. Right? Can you be economically relevant if your maintenance capex is 10 times what a new ship is? Only to a certain point. So that's the big challenge there.
And Randy, I mean, what you were saying earlier, I mean, it was you're able to transition from where the fleet is now, where the ships are now, and changing them over to a new power source, a new fuel. I mean, talk about maybe the retooling. Is it going to be as simple as perhaps one might think?
Yeah, I'll say one quick thing to what Ben was saying earlier. Yeah, ships can certainly last a lot longer, the hull of the ship, but the capex required, the fuel expense, these 20-year vessels currently outstanding, are much less fuel efficient, much higher fuel burn. And the chartering pool is that much less. BP is not chartering out a 24-year-old vessel. So you really shrink the size of your customer base. In terms of replacement, yeah, you have technological advancements throughout shipping, and you've had that always, right, perpetually, either an eco-friendly engine or an eco-friendly hull design. Wärtsilä coming out with all these, LNG powered, ships and being able to retrofit engines with it, or obviously on the new construction side, shipyards have certainly increased their technological advancements as well. So the hull designs have gotten sleeker, more fuel efficient in that regard. So yeah, that has certainly been the bottleneck, and it's going to always be the bottleneck is when are you going to be able to make a energy efficient, cost efficient ammonia powered ship, right? And as Ben was saying earlier, it's 10 to 15 million for an LNG powered ship, more for an ammonia powered ship, right? You need bigger tanks and more specialized tanks and all of these other things. So the cost curve is very high. Now that will flatten as time goes on and as advancements get made, but that is certainly going to be the replacement of these older tonnage.
Well, and I think the other aspect of that is the infrastructure is totally different. I mean, what we're not talking about is the same gas station that has multiple grades of gasoline, right? Premium versus. I mean, a bunkering ship that can deliver LNG is nothing like something that can deliver, an oil-based product. It's a completely separate set of infrastructure. And the same thing would be true of ammonia. You can't put ammonia into an LNG bunkering ship. You have to completely change the entire infrastructure that surrounds it. So it's we're not talking about small steps here.
Yep, agreed.
Well, gentlemen, we are at basically the hour mark here, so we're going to try to wrap up there. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Randy, Ben, and Mike. Today's webinar will be recorded and soon be made available to the registrants and online shortly after this call. So thank you, and you are now free to disconnect.
All right, thanks, Trevor.
Good seeing everybody. Take care.
Thank you.